Welcome, everyone, to the Love Does Not Hurt workshop, part 1. My name is Dr. Nancy Slater. I received my doctorate of ministry degree, and my research was on bringing domestic violence awareness to the faith community in Southeast Atlanta. And that is one of my passions, to bring awareness to this issue to all segments of our communities, all of our faith communities, so that faith leaders will be better prepared for facing the issues of domestic violence, although it is more commonly called now intimate partner violence. And the reason for that is it broadens the area, it broadens the definition to include everyone who has been assaulted, who has been abused by an intimate partner. So let's talk about domestic violence, awareness, or intimate partner violence, and what it means. The definition, and I hope that you can read this on the screen behind me. If not, I have a booklet that is called Love Does Not Hurt. I would be honored to email to you. If you would leave your email or send me an email to psalm31ministries@gmail.com, I will send you the booklet so that you'll be ready for part 2 of our workshop. So, what is domestic violence? According to the National Coalition to End Domestic Violence, the definition is as follows. It is the willful intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, and or other abusive behavior as a part of a systematic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another. In that sentence, I would like you to focus on the two words, a systematic pattern. In other words, this is a planned behavior, a systematic pattern of power and control. The definition goes on to say it includes physical violence, sexual violence, threats, economic, emotional, psychological, financial, and spiritual abuse. More recently known as intimate partner violence, or IPV, this is an abuse or aggression that occurs in a romantic relationship. Intimate partner refers to both current and former spouses and dating partners and can range from one episode of violence that could have a lasting impact to chronic and severe episodes over multiple years. Current statistics state that 1 in 3 women and nearly 1 in 4 men have experienced DV, domestic violence, or IPV, intimate partner violence, in their lifetimes. It occurs in all races, all cultures, all ethnic groups, all ages, all faith groups, and in all genders. So, in other words, it's just not those people, those others down the road. It occurs in a third of our women and nearly 25% of our men. So this slide, you should be able to see a little more clearly. It is called the cycle of violence, and I hope to explain to you what this is all about. The cycle begins with intensive romance and then moves to jealousy. It moves to isolation, establishing control. It includes threats, violence in any form, followed by remorse, apology, and promises to never do it again. And then the cycle repeats itself. And you'll see here in the slide, here's the honeymoon period, the romantic part, and then building, and the tension builds, and there are threats, and then violence, whether it's verbal or emotional, and then the apologies, and then it rotates again. And the sad part of this is that the more it rotates, the shorter the honeymoon period becomes, and the longer the violence and abusive period becomes. It's a really sad factor that so many people have experienced this. Our next slide is also a wheel, and it is called the power and control wheel. This was developed in 1979 by the Duluth Project as a way to educate community and volunteers and staff on what really happens. So the wheel has 8 spokes or 8 pie shapes, and the center hub is labeled power and control. The outer rim, the darker rim, is the violence, both physical and sexual. And the different pie places show and explain and describe the different types of abuse that occur within this wheel. So I'll start in the upper right pie shape here and using intimidation. The next pie shape is using emotional abuse and then using isolation as a way to control the person who is experiencing this abuse. The abuser also uses minimizing and denying. In other words, they do nothing wrong, and blaming everyone else, including the victim, for what happens. The next pie piece is using children as weapons and a way of control. If you don't do this, I will harm the children or the neighbors or your coworkers or members of your family or anyone else that is threatening my control over this situation. The next pie chart is using male privilege. And so I will say in my workshops and demonstrations and in my dissertation, I tried to explain intimate partner violence with gender neutral terms. But at the time that this wheel was invented in the late or mid to late 1970s, the battered women's movement was just developing out of the women's movement. And it was believed and it was known or thought that the only victims of this violence were women. And therefore, it was called the battered women's movement, and that all the perpetrators were men, were male perpetrators. We know this not to be true today. So I will say a disclaimer. Yes, there is male privilege that is being used in abusive situations, but I will also add there is female privilege too, more psychological, more emotional. And it is a proven fact that men upper body strength is stronger, therefore they can harm physically a victim more than, generally speaking, than a woman whose upper body strength is not as strong. But we women do use female privilege as well. So I want to make that clear in this. And we know the statistics that I spoke about when we first started this was 1 in 3 women have experienced domestic violence at least once in their lifetime. Nearly 1 in 4 men. When I began my research in 2019, the statistics were 1 in 15 men. Now it's grown to nearly 1 in 4. Some sources say 1 in 5, some sources say 1 in 4. I don't know how to explain this. I don't know whether there is an increase of intimate partner violence among our male population, or whether the increase is that the situations are now being reported where they weren't reported before. The next pie shape is using economic abuse. If the victim does not have access to a job or a car or money or schooling to better himself or herself, then they are easier to keep under their thumb, the thumb of the abuser. And there's a use of coercion and threats. Once there has been physical harm done, say a fist has been made and they have punched the victim, once that has occurred several times, there is no need to repeat the actual punch. Just making a fist and raising an arm will be enough to keep the victim under control. And that's what it's saying here in the coercion and the threats. What you can't read clearly, and I do apologize for that, is that intimate partner violence is not only about power and control. And remember, I said the power and control is in this center hub. Intimate partner violence is about attitudes and emotions. Abuse grows from attitudes and values, not feelings. Abuse is constant, and threats maintain constant control. So now we have a slight description verbally of what may be going on behind closed doors. So, who's affected by intimate partner violence? The next slide will list those who are affected. Victims, of course. Children who witness the abuse and are abused. Family members, both of the abuser and of the victim, are affected. Family members are waiting on the outside of this circle, wanting to know how they can help, how they can stop this. And families of the abuser are also affected, either positively or negatively. I am not sure what I would be able to do if one of my grown sons was a perpetrator and harming someone else physically and emotionally. How could I deal with that? Probably about as well as they dealt with my survivor story and leaving a second marriage that lasted 4 years, that was full of verbal and sexual and psychological and emotional and physical abuse that almost took my life at the end. And I had to tell my sons, I have left him. I have filed for divorce. I am full of guilt and shame. And they were so startled, so emotionally traumatized. It's not something that we talk about. And I have never told them the details because they don't need to know those details. The details were too painful for me. And why should I put that pain on my adult children? So family members are really uh, involved and really affected, and in many cases traumatized as a not a primary victim, but a secondary victim. Friends are affected as well. Can you imagine having to stand outside the circle and watch a dear friend be abused and not be able to stop it? Neighbors are affected. The screaming, the hollering, the breaking of things, the firing of weapons, that is such an effect on them as well when we expect our neighborhoods and our communities to be safe and quiet places. Bystanders and strangers are also affected. If something is left the privacy of the home and is out on the streets or at a party or at a public event or at a restaurant, everyone else is affected. And first responders are affected as well. The law enforcement officers hate going into a domestic violence call because they know they are at risk. They know that their lives will be threatened, as well as the life of the victim and the children. We also know statistically that 50% of the homicides of victims that occur in the United States occur when the victim is leaving the abuser. And those first responders and those bystanders and those neighbors are affected. What if the abuser pulls a gun and starts firing? Those bullets travel a long way and they can affect anyone that is anywhere near close. And finally, the citizens who pay taxes that fund treatment programs and fund shelters and fund medical care for victims and fund psychological care and treatment and therapy for victims and children, they are affected too. A statistic from 2016 put out by the CDC stated that a female victim, the physical medical expenses average $103,000 in her lifetime. The effect of a male victim is $24,000. And I don't know why those numbers are so grossly far apart. It could be that in 2016, there were not that many reports of male victims. And so their medical expenses were not tracked through their lifetime. But if Medicare, Medicaid, uninsured victims are involved, then the taxpayer is also involved in that statistic. So we think of domestic violence as a rather private thing that happens behind closed doors and it's none of our business, but just realizing who is really affected should change our attitude about knowing and wanting to know more and being more aware so that we can assist in reducing these causes and actions and eventually eliminating them. So, what are the effects of DV on a victim? The victim never feels completely safe. I'll repeat that. They never, never feel completely safe. They are unable to stop the abuse and they become submissive to every request. Remember, I lived through it. I'm a survivor, I'm a thriver. And it was easier for me to nod my head, to submit, than it was to battle physically and emotionally, to fight, to argue, to scream, to have weapons pulled on me and pointed at me because I was not being submissive. So it's easier. And I honor the victims. They are very clever and they know how to survive. Whatever it takes, they know how to survive. I describe them as prisoners of war. Think of our fighting men and women. Think of our men and women who are in the armed forces and are fighting battles. And they do not feel completely safe in a war zone. What about those that are battling in Ukraine? They don't feel completely safe either, and neither does a victim of intimate partner violence. There is no time or opportunity when he or she can feel safe. They believe that they are at fault and they feel shame and guilt. Why? Because that's what they've been told. The abuser takes no responsibility or blame for the actions, except in the I'm sorry period, right before the honeymoon period, and right after they say this will never happen again. So they are at fault. You burnt the toast. You didn't iron my shirt properly. You didn't clean the house. You're not disciplining the children. There's just a multitude of things that a victim can be blamed for, female victim and male victim. You're too fat, you're too thin, you're too tall, you're too short, you're too stupid, you're too dumb. Anything to put the victim down and keep them down and keep them controlled and submissive. A victim loses all feeling of self-worth, self-esteem, and self-love. And I can attest to that. I can attest to that. They can question their spiritual beliefs and value and may question why God allowed the abuse. And I can attest to that too. So if you are a minister or a church leader or a person of faith watching this, be very careful when you're dealing with a survivor that have stepped away from an abuser to be safe and to protect their children and their pets and their family and their friends and their neighbors and their coworkers, because they're fragile. And we don't often know why things happen, but we have to blame somebody. I'm going to blame the abuser for a while, but I can also question God. And I did. However, I can say at this point in the workshop, as I look back, now this is 2024, and my marriage ended in December of 2005. So I'm a long ways away from that abuse. And my trauma is healed and my PTSD is gone. But had that not happened to me, I would not have become a volunteer to help other women and children. I would not have become a volunteer and an employee of the Women's Resource Center to End Domestic Violence, an agency here in the city where I live. I work at the shelter or the safe house, and I answer the crisis lines, and I advocate for people who call in crisis. And I get it, and I understand it because I went through it. And therefore, those of us who work at Women's Resource Center, who are survivors, have a great deal of empathy for our clients and residents that we work with. And if I didn't know about domestic violence from the inside out, I would never have chosen that subject as my dissertation title. I would never have desired to bring this awareness to the faith community, which turns their blinders on so they don't have to see domestic violence because it doesn't make any sense. It makes no sense that a person who believes in God could harm someone else so drastically. I don't understand it, and I lived through it. But our pastors and our ministers and our elders and our church leaders, no matter your faith, need to know about this so that they can better deal and address the situation, keeping the victim and the children safe and holding the perpetrator accountable. So I am thankful that I went through it, that I survived it. I am much stronger than I ever was. And I was pretty strong when I married this person. I was 61. I figured I was smart enough to know if anything was going to go wrong. And there lies the extent of my guilt and shame. At 65, I was a divorcee, embarrassed. Why didn't I know? We don't think of domestic violence affecting senior citizens, but it does. It affects everyone. Remember, I said that. Everyone, no matter their economic situations. I have spoken at fundraisers, and one of the speakers at the fundraiser was a physician. And she left her husband because he was so immensely cruel to her. And one would think, well, that shouldn't happen to physicians, doctors, but it does. It happens everywhere. 1 in 3 women, there's pain in the pews and there's holy hush inside our church and faith buildings because we don't want to admit that it happens everywhere. A victim develops health issues, stress, fatigue, anxiety, eating problems, eating disorders, headaches, high blood pressure, heart problems, depression, disassociation, hives, shingles, substance abuse, suicidal thoughts, and are unproductive at work if they are even allowed to go to work. The abuser that I was married to would call me 12 to 15 times a day at work. In the latter part of our marriage, he was not working and I was the sole breadwinner, so he had lots of time to call me. What was I doing? Was I having lunch with my male coworkers? What, he was just checking up on me, intensely jealous of everyone. And what did that do to my productivity? You can imagine 15 calls a day just from him. I was an operations manager in a small real estate firm, and we managed commercial and residential properties in Seattle and Las Vegas. I should have been dealing with phone calls from tenants who needed repairs or talked about a rent increase or a rent reduction or a renewing a lease or whatever issues they needed to talk to me about. I shouldn't have been talking to him. So my productivity went down immensely. And not every employer is as generous and understanding as mine were. The estimated decrease in productivity is about $12 billion a year in the United States, whether it's from phone calls like what I was going through, or paid medical leave, or injuries and not able to work 100%, or emotional distraught. This is what domestic violence cost us in productivity. And those are statistics from pre-2019. So why, we've heard the question, well, why doesn't she just leave? Or why doesn't he just leave? Why does the victim stay? First of all, I'm incensed when I hear that question because no one, actually, there are a few, But generally, our culture never asks, why does he abuse her? Why is he hurting his children? Or why is she being so abusive? We never ask that. We expect the victim just to pick up and leave. So why does the victim stay? They stay to protect the children. The threats are there. If you leave, I will kill them. If you leave, I will kill you. If you leave, I will kill myself. They stay to protect the children, protect the pets, protect the friends and relatives and coworkers who have also been threatened with harm and death. They stay because they fear for their lives, and they know that 50% of the victims who leave an abuser are murdered. It's the most critical time in their existence as a victim, and they know that. So they have to plan strategically and be very, very clever in their planning to leave. And a victim will leave when the time is right for them. I'll repeat that. The victim will leave when the time is right for them because they know it's not right for mom and dad. It's not right for the neighbors. It's not right for the employer. It doesn't matter. I have spoken at a funeral where the brother on his white horse and with his armor shine brightly rode in to save his sister from the abuser, and they were both murdered. And I spoke at the funeral and looked at the mother who had lost both of her children and who was holding her grandson that she was faced to raise, all because the victim wasn't ready to leave. The time wasn't right for her. And I think about that mother, that grandmother often, but we can't go charging in because horrible things happen when we do. We must stand aside and let the victim know we're here and we're ready when you are. Just let us know. They fear for their lives. The victim also feels unworthy to live any other way, if you can imagine that. And that's that threats and intimidation and verbal and psychological abuse that's convinced them that they deserve nothing greater than where they are, being a punching bag. They also have no job skills. So there's a financial burden and there's no place else to go. A waitress at Waffle House cannot afford the rent in the city where I live. I'm outside of Atlanta Metro. The average wage needed in Atlanta to pay rent, that is a third of your income, is $103,000. In my neighborhood, outside of Atlanta, it's 87,000, the average. So tell me how someone making $10 or $12 an hour, remember that Georgia has a $5.85 minimum wage level. Tell me how a victim, a survivor, a victim can work at Waffle House or Denny's or, I'm not picking on any of the restaurants, and be able to pay rent and feed her children and pay the utilities and pay for transportation to and from work and pay for childcare. So they stay. They stay because of lack of financial support. They stay for threats because of the threats of the abuser. They stay because the stigma of divorce I know what that was like. And there is no place to go. The shelters are full. Georgia has 11 million in population now. It just went up. And we have 41 shelters in this state, one shelter devoted to men. So tell me how a victim who is running away from an abuser is going to find a place to stay. The homeless emergency shelters are also full in our state, and I'm sure in your state and in your city and your community. So they stay. They stay and they submit, and that is the way they live. And it's really, really sad. The first comment of why they stay is they stay to protect the children. And we know now that that is a fallacy, that children raised in an abusive environment are 3 times more likely to be abusers in adulthood than their peers. So when a victim steps out of that abusive situation and becomes a survivor, takes that first step toward survivorship, she is doing, or he is doing, a service to their children. Because their children in our shelter, there's a children's program that works with children, that talks about mediation and controlling of emotions and retraining behavior, so that when they are adults, they are not going to repeat what they saw modeled in their young childhood. So, moms that make that step, I always applaud them because they're breaking the chain. They're drawing a line in the sand. They're saying, my children will not grow up to repeat what we have lived through. So let's talk about the abusive personality. We know the effects of DV on a victim. We know the definition. We know that it occurs in a third of the women and 20 to 25% of the men in the United States. We know that it affects everyone, including strangers and bystanders. So let's talk about this abusive personality. What has happened to this person? What are their traits? They believe, and was demonstrated as they were growing up, that jealousy is a sign of love. Isn't that amazing? That to be jealous, so be jealous out of control, they believe shows that they are truly love their partner. They believe control is a sign of concern for partner's safety. And I heard that many times, you know, those 12 to 15 calls a day that I received. Just concern for your safety. How are you doing? What are you doing? Are you safe? The abusive personality pushes for romantic commitment that leaves them in control. So it could be 3 or 4 dates and then they want to move in together. It could be a month of dating or 2 months of dating. Let's get married. Let's commit to each other. In other words, I want you under my roof where I can control your every action and attempt to control your thoughts. They expect their partners to be perfect and to care for them. Abusers expect to be cared for. A male abuser is often using a partner as a substitute for their mother. Not always, but it is understandable if you think of it that way. The abuser expects to be cared for. In other words, You are my slave, and I am your owner. They manipulate the partner into believing that friends and family are bad and will insist that the partner not associate with them. And that begins the isolation. Don't go to church, please, or go to my church, or let's not go to church at all. Let's stay home. Do you really have to go to that meeting after work? Why don't you come home? I'm not feeling very well. I don't want you to go to your mother's, and please don't call your dad as often as you used to. Talk to me instead. I'm the one that loves you. They don't. They blame others for their problems. They will not accept accountability for their actions. They are often cruel to children and pets because when they were children, they were treated cruelly in many instances. And there is that phrase that hurting people hurt people. They use force and sex. They are verbally abusive and they threaten physical harm. And the term marital rape is very common in abusive relationships. They seem to have a dual personality and they have mood swings. They're nice 1 minute and they're angry the next. One of our support group participants stated at a meeting, I thought it was brilliant, and I've used this term and explanation so many times since then. She said, I fell in love with the representative of who that person really was. And there again, that's in that romance stage of a relationship. They are on a white horse and their armor is brightly shining, and they are going to save us, just as in the fairy tale books that we read when we were children. And then we find that the horse wasn't real and the armor was not very clean and shiny. And underneath that armor is the real person. And oh my goodness, how did I get into this mess? So the abusive personality are incredibly clever and manipulative. And they are nice 1 minute and angry the next because they have no control over their emotions. They have no control over their attitudes. They have no control over their behavior. And that is what domestic violence is. It is a lack of control. They are insecure. They are unable to show empathy for others, and they are easily insulted. And they feel if someone doesn't agree with them, that they are suffering an injustice. They feel entitled and they use force. And they were often abused as children and model what they saw as children. So there comes the term hurting people hurt people. I'm going to show you another power and control wheel, and it talks about the different types of abuse in each one of these pie wedges, is each one of these spokes. There is intellectual abuse. In other words, using insults to our ability to think and reason. Intellectually, we are demoralized. You're not very smart. In fact, you're really pretty dumb. And after you hear that for a period of weeks, days, weeks, months, hours, you tend to believe it and you think, well, maybe they all right, and maybe there really is something wrong with me. Financial abuse, no credit cards in your name, no access to car keys, no access to funds for Ubers and Lyft and metro buses, no access to jobs, no access to school to improve yourself. The person in control controls all the finances. One of those that attended the support group that I attended when I was first a survivor did work. However, she had to bring home her paycheck and the abuser cashed it. If she went to the grocery store, she was given cash. She had to return the exact change according to the receipt, or she was beaten. So there was really financial control there. They use pets and property abuse as a means. I'm going to hurt the pet. I'm going to, break the windows out of your car. I'm going to break the windows out of our rental place if you don't settle down and do what I ask. There's physical abuse, which doesn't need any explanation. Verbal abuse, sexual abuse. I did mention marital rape. Trust me, it exists. Spiritual abuse. Why are you reading that Bible? Or why don't you read the Bible more? Or what are you reading the New International Version for? You're better off reading the King James Version. Or why don't you go to synagogue with me? Or why or do you refuse? Or let's read the Quran. Let's go to mosque together. Or don't you dare go. Um, God told me that I could hit you. Somewhere in the Old Testament, it might say that. God said, or my pastor said, or my imam said. Spiritual abuse is really, really tough. They use children as weapons. There's social abuse as well, abuse and cultural abuse. Using culture, if there are couples who have been married out of their culture, and so there's a blending of culture and a blending of families. Oh gosh, it takes work to overcome the differences. And there is emotional abuse as well. Making you cry and then making fun of you, or criticizing you if you don't cry, or if you scream or show fear. There is that criticism again. It is so pervasive, and in every way it is. So we're going to end this first session now, and I'll review that we have talked about the definition of intimate partner violence, a more common term used now, the definition of domestic violence. It is willful and intimidating and a systematic pattern of abuse. We talked about the cycle of violence or the cycle of abuse and how it goes from romance then to physical abuse, and then I'm so sorry, I'll never do it again. Uh, we talked about the power and control wheel and how those pie chart sizes described the different types of abuse. We talked about who is affected by intimate partner violence and learned that it's not just the victim. The perpetrator is also affected. The children are affected. The pets are affected. The neighbors, the relatives, first responders, co-workers. And the American taxpayer is affected too. We never knew whether the person that I was married to was going to come blasting into the office and shoot up the place. It was 2001 to 2005. AK-47s were not as common as they are now, but he certainly was well armed. And I really never knew whether he was going to come in or not and hurt those dear people that I worked with and my precious employees who were on my side, or employers who were on my side. So I thank you so much for attending this first session. If you want a copy of the booklet or have any questions, I will be honored to send you a PDF of the booklet that I'm using in this workshop. Email psalm31ministries@gmail.com. If you have any questions, I would be honored to answer them or reply to them. I don't have all the answers, but you can ask questions and I will make responses. If you have comments, I would also love to hear those as well. I would be honored by your honesty, and also tell your friends, tell those other people that they should watch this. That they should watch this recording as well.